It's fantastic to be here surrounded by all this great, this woodwork, and most of all these people, you all who are part of this movement to explore how to co-create a better world, which is the subheading of Pilot Projects Design Collective, my company, co-create a better world, and we have to do that together. So I thought I would make a dramatic entrance with a pile of wood and a cup of coffee, and sort of, why is this guy carrying wood and coffee around? Some of you have seen me out at the Partner Forest coffee truck. And really, it's all about forests, climate, working together in cities, and creating change. And I'm going to just tell you about my story, and hopefully just bring you into that story, and we'll have some time for conversation afterwards. So, speaking of stories, I grew up surrounded by wood. This is a shot of my mom at our kitchen island, which is made of solid black walnut, which my father made before I was born. And I grew up every day, while I lived at home, having food prepared on this beautiful piece of wood that was assembled from a tree that my dad had to cut down because it had died, and it was like, what are we going to do with this wood? So wood was just sort of part of my DNA growing up, and I grew up in Canada. I'm from Canada. Canada is famous for canoes, which are mostly traditionally made of wood. So it was just, wood just was part of the way of being in Canada. And I became an architect, and it felt like a very natural thing to do. I learned to love making things, designing things. I got to build in this beautiful landscape of Canada with these gorgeous forests and water, lakes, and make buildings. And so I found myself in my early 20s as a young architect building buildings, mostly out of wood, which I loved. But it was after a long journey, and I moved to New York City, had an opportunity to work in New York, working on larger projects. And my favorite place in New York City was the Brooklyn Bridge. And the Brooklyn Bridge has a wooden boardwalk that stretches over the East River. And almost every day I would walk across this boardwalk, and one day I thought, wait a second, now where's this wood from? I knew it was a tropical hardwood, and that question took me on a whole new journey of thinking about design and sustainability. I quickly found out that that wood was greenheart, coming from a forest in Guyana, and it raised a lot of questions for me about what happened to that forest. I grew up loving forests as much as I grew up loving wood, and that journey is what has brought me here today. So I became, years later, the co-founder of Cities for Forests. And Cities for Forests is an organization which is bringing cities into this conversation through the councils, and the decisions that those councils are making about where products, and in particular wood, is sourced from. Cities for Forests works at 3 scales. We work at the inner forest scale, which is the trees and forests within the city boundaries that municipalities have direct control over. The nearby forests, which would be anything within a few hundred kilometers, and which are very important for recreation, watershed, biodiversity. And in particular, we work in the faraway forests. For cities, the faraway forests are forests anywhere in the world. And we know more and more every day how important these forests are for our climate, number one, for biodiversity, number one, for people's livelihoods, and basically social flourishing on our planet, also number one. There can't be a number 2 in this. So these forests are vital to our survival. They're vital to our survival in cities. So bringing that conversation into cities became a real passion, and we brought many organizations, funders, and collaborators into this. Very quickly, there's a few tools that we've created, and I'll get into a few of these in detail, that we're using to engage municipalities in this conversation. We recently launched a call to action, which we've had about 75 cities from around the world sign on to declare the importance of this and raise this to national government levels so that the cities' voices are being heard by national governments. We've created a publication, which is really, it was supposed to be launched before COP. It's coming out kind of any day now. It's consolidating the global research on forests and how forests relate to cities and the co-benefits that cities and forests share together, so that anyone in a decision-making role can have access to that information. We've got forest footprinting tools. How many hectares of tropical forest does a city like Glasgow, like Toronto or Montreal, consume just through their daily business? the food and products that a city uses. But what I'm going to talk about today are two programs, the Sustainable Wood for Cities and the Partner Forest Program. So I guess going back to the question of what are the relationships, we know now that cities are responsible for the majority, the vast majority really, of climate emissions. It's well over 70% that cities are directly responsible for. We also know that just tropical forests alone are responsible for somewhere between 8 and 10% of emissions, direct emissions. Okay? But if you actually look at the restoration potential and just stopping deforestation, you get up to about 30%. It's an incredible number just through tropical forests. So we're looking at that and saying, how do we bring these two things together? How do we have cities and forests talk to each other, learn from each other? We are in this relationship, and it's unavoidable that cities and forests are in a relationship with each other. It's now a matter of how do we get it right. When it comes to wood, wood is one of the products that represents that flow. And we'll talk about specifics later. But we keep asking this question. If we want to use wood, which I do, and everyone in the room here I think says, yes, we think wood is a great material, how do we know how to do that sustainably? And it's not an easy question to answer, as it turns out. We do know, and we've heard from almost all the presenters today, to sort of show different views on how wood shows up in the city. More and more, the cities are the place where this conversation is happening. Wood is becoming an urban material. For many, for the last century, it's essentially been a non-urban material, and it's becoming an urban material once again. But even, when wood was, we didn't have mass timber buildings to discuss, we were still building in cities with wood. We were building boardwalks and benches and components. The wood was still there. It's now coming to center stage. So I got this email yesterday from one of my hundreds and hundreds of wood collaborators, CBC, that's the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, much like the BBC. This is an article from 2 days ago. The conversation about sustainable wood is ongoing. It is a debate. It is of growing concern and growing awareness. So CBC's article from a couple days ago is, we're not getting this calculation right. We don't know the answer. We think we know the answer, but we don't know the answer to the carbon footprint, the true net carbon footprint of wood. Canada is very wrapped up in this, of course, massive forestry sector in Canada. And how many here have heard of Michael Green, architect? Okay, a few of you. So he's a prominent young Canadian architect, a little bit like Andrew Waugh, who's leading in the design sphere of building in mass timber. So he's been a great voice for mass timber. He, who's a friend and a very trusted colleague, was in a debate on CBC about 2 weeks ago with a forestry expert, John Palmer, who's also a friend. These guys were going at it like, what's a good analogy? Anyway, they were about to fight. They were on the radio, so they couldn't get physical, but it was getting to that point on this particular topic. What is the relationship between wood demand, increasing wood demand, forests, and carbon? Now, if two of the most trusted people in my network are fighting live on the air about this topic, what I can say is we don't quite know the answer, and I'm sure about that. I'm sure most of you have been reviewing the research, and there's many great papers out there that we refer to all the time. Probably we're using some of the same scientific literature. And that literature is divided. There's a spectrum of what is a relationship between increasing wood demand to supply wood for these beautiful urban buildings that we know we need to do, and we know we need to figure out how to do this to wean ourselves from fossil fuel-oriented construction, but we don't necessarily fully understand the impacts of that yet. So one of the questions we ask to this is, how do cities, if cities are going to be active players in this, if they're really going to be making these decisions, if city councils are going to be specifying wood for, say, public housing as one sector, how do they know how to do that well? And when you look at the supply chains, for the most part, you have to admit it looks a bit like this. By the time you're getting the wood into your building, the idea of exactly where it came from has become quite obscure. Now, I have to say that's one of the reasons I love the homegrown Scottish timber proposition, because it brings that closer to home. It looks a little bit more like this. So this is where we need to be moving towards if we're going to be able to answer the question of, is our wood sustainable? And that is creating more direct and more transparent connections between the source of the wood and the use of the wood. The source of the wood being the forest, taking the entire ecosystem of the forest into consideration, the people that are there, and then all the other actors in the supply chain, so that we can confidently answer these questions. But even more so, and I may remember the question I asked to Andrew when he was up here, is how do you make that connection really powerful, emotional, real, and tangible to the consumer? And I think that is one of the great challenges before us. And actually, it's a really fun challenge to solve because it's not that difficult. People love wood. They love to talk about wood. So there's an opportunity there to make this connection mutually beneficial so that the folks in the forest side and the folks in the urban side are talking to each other. So what is sustainable wood? We've created a platform, it's in process, and we'd love to invite all of you here to have a look at it and participate. We've identified 4 categories that determine sustainable wood. One is, what are the impacts on the forest? A huge topic, but still important just to single it out. What is the net carbon storage? Not easy to answer either, but very important if we're going to talk about wood and climate. The other is the CO2 comparison with other alternative materials. You can't make a comparison if you don't know what you're comparing with, right? So these two things are different. How do you understand the net carbon? How do you compare it to other materials? And then, very importantly, and we can sometimes forget about this one, but we shouldn't, and that is the social impact and the social benefits. So through that, we've created a platform to evaluate different sources of wood. And the reason I brought these pieces up here is, here's a piece of wood from tropical rainforest in Guyana. This is the material that the Brooklyn Bridge Promenade is made of. It's greenheart. Amazing wood growing in a natural rainforest. Should we use this wood? How do we know? How do we know if we should use that wood or not? Of course, here's some of your Scottish homegrown wood that you've used in some of these buildings. And I won't lift it up right now, but there's a piece of ash that's being cut from a tree, a local tree, to Glasgow. That was a tree that was destined for decomposition, and now we're putting it into use as timber. So we've identified 8 pathways. Before I show you what that looks like, I want to say that this is a platform that's been developed with a community of practice. 3, in fact, and there's others that have participated. Wood at Work involves hundreds of people in the sector, and we've had conversations over the years to co-create this framework for evaluating wood sustainability. So what we identified is that there's pathways. You could say, well, I want to do something good with wood. I want to make sure it's sustainable. I'm going to use local urban trees. So does that sound like it would be sustainable trees that maybe the city is having to cut anyway? New York City, for example, take a guess at how many tons of, quote, wood waste they dispose of every year in tonnage. 40,000 tons every year of wood waste just into the rubbish bin. So if you can put that wood to work, you can think, well, that's got to be sustainable, right? So that's a pathway. Another is certification. If we can certify rigorously, we can actually create parameters and structures to follow. So I'll just quickly read through them. The forest certification, social forestry, working with communities, this is where this is from, that are doing forest conservation at a high level. Making sure you specify the right species and grade, lesser known species, lower grades, reducing the pressure on forests. That's another pathway you can take. Choosing where the wood is from. Strategic geography is about really determining what is a good place to source your wood from, because we know there's some bad actors out there regionally, we know there's some bad actors country-wise, and we know there's some places in the world that are actually putting parameters around forestry and production that are really doing a good job. Let's reward those groups to help them continue to do that good job. Local and urban wood I've mentioned, reusing wood. That's got to be sustainable, right? It's got to be sustainable if you're taking a piece of wood that was destined for the trash and you're putting it to use. High efficiency production is how much wood are you able to take from that forest and turn it into a long life wood product. So I'll put a number out there. If the number is only 25% that's coming from your forest and making it into a 50 to 100-year building, is that really sustainable? And all the rest of it, the other 75%, is going into paper cups or biofuel or decomposed matter on the forest floor, is that sustainable? It may not be. And then the last one is net carbon accounting, and that's our ability, and this is where we really have to co-create now, our ability to accurately calculate the true net carbon potential of any given piece of wood. So I'll show you how we put this to work with a few different examples. So we've actually done some work here in Glasgow with woodworker Paul Hodgkiss, who is actually here. I think he's out of the Woodmiser mill. He has been restoring the Battlefield Rest. How many people know of this famous landmark in Glasgow? A wonderful little restaurant now. It's being restored for probably at least the second time in its life. And they chose a wood for the balustrades that had to be replaced. They ended up choosing a wood before we got involved. It's eucalyptus from Uruguay. So we used this tool to evaluate the sustainability and show that this plantation forestry that was being done in Uruguay actually had reached a very high level of sustainability, not just going by what they said on the website, but really digging into that history, and we're able to give them a really good stamp of approval on this particular type of wood. Another one is a gardens project outside of Philadelphia, and another is the two cities that are using this. So for the bench from Longwood Gardens, this is a company that came to us and said, well, we've got a few different options of wood that we're looking at. One is Thermery, that's thermally modified ash. Greenheart from Guyana, that we actually suggested, Jarrah from Australia, and Kebony from New Zealand, which is a modified radiata pine. How do we know which one is best? They came to us and said, we want to do the best sustainability we can with our choice, and we worked through this process. And this is sort of what it looked like. We used each of the pathways. This is where it kind of gets interesting, and that is these pathways are not independent, they're interdependent. So you can have certified wood that also comes from a social forestry project, right? So FSC certified plus from a community. So in this case, this is the Greenheart from Guyana, one of the best social forestry programs in the world, showing conservation benefits, also FSC certified. Also a species and grade selection possibly. Is it a strategic geography? And each of these has a whole system to evaluate, basically a numerical rating system. Give yourself a 0, a 1, a 2, or a 3 for each of these categories and sort of add them up. And this is a self-evaluation tool. It doesn't give you a kind of an official stamp. It just shows you what you're actually dealing with when you're looking at these multiple choices. And so the partner forest Boardwalk, a little sample of which is out beside our truck, is actually, it's Pucté. It's a timber from Central America, and it comes again from a concession management program that is showing the best forest conservation rates compared to even strict preservation in the region. So we know that by buying timber from this community, you're helping to conserve that rainforest with all of the benefits of biodiversity, carbon, and social benefits. Doesn't mean that the timber Pucté, here it is here, it doesn't mean that this timber itself is always good, because it could be someone next door is doing illegal logging and they're getting a piece of wood that looks just like this one. So this is where the relationships become absolutely critical. And then telling the story. So this was an offcut from our lasering, telling the story on the wood. We feel that's really important because we want people year after year to ask the question when they see this piece of wood, like, oh, where did this come from? Oh, this is this concession, Carmelita. I'm going to look them up. Actually, maybe I'm going to go visit them. And actually, Andrew Waugh, when we were talking at the coffee truck, said, Carmelita. And I don't know if Andrew's still here. I was there in my 20s. He was actually in this concession. That's the kind of story that we want, because these are real places, real people, real forests, and real impacts. So that has to be made real to the end user and to the architects, like all of us who are specifying wood. And that's really the Partner Forest program. So you can take the Sustainable Wood for Cities platform, which we invite you all to use. It's partnerforests.org. is our site, and you can go there and get to the Sustainable Wood for Cities platform. The Partner Forest program, taking it a step further. Talked about the Brooklyn Bridge. Well, what actually happened when I walked across the Brooklyn Bridge that day is 13 years worth of research and discovery and action and community building to look at how to actually do this right for New York City. We recently, year and a half ago, we won the New York City's competition for reimagining the Brooklyn Bridge. So our team that had been working together for all that time actually won the competition. A new mayor is being elected any day now in New York who's on board we see this project is actually happening, which is creating a long-term relationship with the forest community that will be producing the hardwood planks in perpetuity for this bridge. Again, relationships, relationships, relationships. That's why we're here together. That's the biggest thing that we're going to take away from coming together here is meeting people, developing relationships, learning from each other. And we can do that at a global scale too, because we don't have all the answers, but people that are actually in these forests, working these forests, they have knowledge that we don't have. And we have knowledge that they don't have. So that kind of mutual exchange is so critical. Well, I think you've got the idea of the Partner Forest Program, but it's not just wood. It's also this cup of coffee from Intag, Ecuador, the cloud forest of Ecuador. Well, I have to tell you a little romantic story, and that is around the same time I was starting the Brooklyn Bridge Forest Project, a young lady named Sarah was doing her PhD research in Intag, and 6 years ago we got married on the Brooklyn Bridge after we met through a mutual connection. She's a forest ecologist, I'm an architect, bring those together, and you get the Cities for Forest program. So it's not just about wood, it's also about things like coffee. So that coffee is being grown by a community who is committed to cloud forest restoration in Intag. So you've got two choices when you're buying your coffee. You've got like business as usual coffee that is very likely involved in deforestation because coffee is one of the significant deforestation drivers in the world. And then you've got another coffee which you know is coming from a community that is making sure the forest is standing because they're growing it under the forest. So they need to keep the forest standing. And these are the choices globally we have to make. And that's what the Partner Forest Program does, is it brings those choices into the cities and helps deal with this problem again, which is that climate change is really a function of deforestation. I mean, one of the main drivers of climate change is deforestation. Let's reverse it by making those partnerships. So put that into the city. Put it on the city hall front steps. Put it on every park bench. Any piece of infrastructure that you're building in the city with wood, make that story real. Make it creative. Cities are full of creative people, artists, storytellers. Bring that story into the city and have that become part of the identity of Glasgow or part of the identity of London. The Mayor of London 3 days ago signed our call to action. Paris has signed the call to action, and they've actually made a commitment to tropical forests. So cities are starting to actually do this. This is becoming real. I want to see a groundswell where thousands of cities from around the world are all deciding that they need to have a relationship with a tropical forest, a positive, mutually beneficial relationship. Could be based on sourcing rubber or coffee or timber or other products, even climate forest carbon credits, which is an emerging valid market as that becomes more sophisticated. And the world should start to look like this, where the dots of cities and the dots of forest are starting to connect near and far. We understand, recognize, and invest in that kind of mutual relationship. So that's really our program, Cities for Forests. I'd love to talk to you more about it, and I'll stop there and let's talk in a few minutes.